Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you today? May you always be healthy and full of blessings. Before starting, let's start by reciting a prayer. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. May this prayer be a way for us to get intercession from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the Day of Judgment. Ameen. Hello Muslim friends, meet again with the Islamic Lantern channel. Before we continue, it would be nice if we support this channel by clicking the subscribe, like, comment, and share buttons. This little Muslim boy innocently entered the church and asked the old priest why Jesus was crucified. The child made the whole church laugh, and the anti-Islam priest belittled him. However, who would have thought that this child's innocent question would make the priest frustrated and unable to answer? Let's listen to this exciting story, and hopefully, those who subscribe will have their fortunes smoothed. The morning sun shone through the large windows of the old church, spreading light into the room filled with the congregation. The building, with ancient stone walls, stood majestically in the middle of a small town in Western Europe, witnessing thousands of services that had taken place for centuries. However, today was not an ordinary service. As usual, Pastor Paulus Andreas stood upright in the pulpit, wearing his grand black robe. His wrinkled face looked even sharper in the sunlight that penetrated the glass. The congregation, which numbered thousands, waited solemnly. Their eyes were fixed on their spiritual leader. Pastor Paulus took a deep breath and then opened his hands to the sky. With a loud voice that echoed throughout the church, he began to preach. My brothers and sisters in faith, we live in an era full of walls, with modern lies that threaten our truth. The congregation began to cheer a little. Some even laughed, some muttered words of agreement, while others clenched their fists full of emotion. The atmosphere in the church grew intense. It was not the sun that made it hot, but the burning anger from within. As the pastor continued his sentence, a creaking sound was heard from the main door of the church. All heads turned, their attention diverted. The church door opened slowly, and a small figure stepped in. A 5-year-old boy wearing simple clothes, looking a little unruly. His black curly hair was messy, but his eyes were clear and full of calm. What surprised everyone the most was that, in his small hands, he held a Quran. The whole church was immediately in an uproar. Some of the congregation were shocked, while others immediately laughed, seeing the boy's courage to enter the church carrying the holy book of Islam. Some parents shook their heads, thinking this was a strange joke. Pastor Paulus, who had originally stood upright with full confidence, now stood frozen, his expression unreadable. The little boy, with his eyes narrowed, was gasping for breath. The pastor was there. There was an air of silence followed by laughter. The boy's name was Burke. I heard you, said Berbera Tenisam. He lifted the Quran and the crowd cheered. Burke, determined, was set to challenge their leader in their own house of worship. Pastor Paulus Andreas stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of his centuries-old pulpit, staring intently at the little boy who stood not far from him. The church was stunned, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The little boy, panting, was challenging the pastor. The atmosphere, once filled with cheers, had turned tense. A hushed silence took over. Our God is not the God of the book you believe in, the pastor declared, his voice heavy and commanding. Pastor Paulus took a deep breath. Listen, little child, your religion worships a different God. Muhammad was just an ordinary man who misled people with this book. You are too young to understand this. Zachariah stood straight, unaffected by the priest's condescending tone. He stepped forward, reached for the altar, picked up a small cross statue, and lifted it with both hands. With an innocent yet piercing voice, he asked, May I ask you something? Pastor Paulus regarded the boy with cautious attention. Zachariah held the small cross firmly and then said, Why was God baptized? The entire church fell silent. Pastor Paulus was taken aback, his forehead wrinkling. The congregation, which had been whispering moments before, now watched in anticipation. The priest tried to compose himself and answered, Jesus did this to set an example for humanity, to provide guidance and understanding. But even as he spoke, he struggled to convince himself. He had stood at this pulpit for years, and no one had ever posed such a question. Finally, he exhaled deeply and admitted with a strained voice, "That is the mystery of faith." Zachariah remained unshaken. "Something that cannot be explained?" The silence thickened. Something was amiss. The priest, usually confident, now hesitated. The congregation, who had been amused before, now sat in contemplation, questioning something deep within themselves. Pastor Paulus stiffened, determined to regain control of the situation. In a loud voice, he said, "Little child, you are just a boy who knows nothing about religion. What do you know about God?" Zachariah kept smiling. He looked directly into the priest's eyes and softly replied, "I only asked out of curiosity. If you cannot answer, that's okay." Once again, the church fell into an unbearable silence. Pastor Paulus Andreas felt the heat creeping up the back of his neck. The congregation, who had always looked at him with respect, now looked at him with different expressions. Some looked doubtful, some confused, while others began to show something even more frightening. For an AG Kagwan Zakar Barega, his face was free of any impression of arrogance or evil intentions. But his little questions had caused doubt in the hearts of the congregation, who were blind to the conflict of their beliefs. The priest waved his hands brusquely and said, "Okay, little child, if you believe in your religion so much, let's see. Can you explain something?" Zakar smiled, as if not bothered by the priest's challenging tone. "Please say briefly." Pastor Paulus stared at him sharply, then said, "Muhammad claimed to be the last prophet, but he was just an ordinary human who died and was buried like everyone else. How could a human be the last prophet while Jesus rose from the dead and ascended to heaven? Isn't that proof that Jesus is higher than Muhammad?" The congregation, who had been silent, began to nod in agreement. Some began to smile, convinced that this time their pastor would defeat the little boy. But Zakar remained still. He stared at the pastor with full sincerity, then answered, "If someone died and was buried, does that mean he was not a messenger of God?" The priest frowned. "Of course, yes. If someone was truly a messenger of God, then he must have great power, as Jesus, who rose from death." Zakar nodded slowly, then asked, "Then what about Moses? What about Abraham? What about Noah? They also died and were buried. Were they not messengers of God?" The congregation fell into silence. "So that's it," Zakar continued. "In fact, the prophets are messengers sent by God to convey revelations, not to be worshipped. Muhammad is just a human being, like Moses and Abraham. But he brought the last revelation of God to mankind. Isn't that more important?" Pastor Paulus grew increasingly restless. The congregation, once convinced, was now filled with doubt again. With a gasp, Pastor Paulus tried to control himself. With a voice that sounded desperate, he said, "But Muhammad spread his teachings with a sword. A religion that cannot be spread peacefully cannot be from God." Zakar remained silent for a moment before replying, "Then what about the people who spread Christianity with war? What about the massacres in Andalusia? Doesn't history also record that Christians have forced their beliefs with power?" Pastor Paulus was shocked. He didn't expect a small child to ask such a heavy question. He bowed his head, grimacing. Some of the congregation began to feel restless. Pastor Paulus, who had been known as a person who always had the answer to everything, was now silent in front of a 5-year-old child. He felt his blood rushing quickly, his hands sweating, even though. The church room was cold. The congregation, which had always looked at him as an unshakable leader, now began to show something he was afraid of. Kagwan Zachariah remained standing upright. His small body seemed unaffected by the sharp gaze of the thousands of people who filled the church. His face remained innocent, his voice remained soft, but his words were a hard slap for Pastor Paulus. Pastor Paulus pulled Nostal, trying to control his emotions. With a voice as calm as possible, he said, "Maybe, little child, you speak as Jesus." Mencken and Kanang just smiled. He looked directly into Pastor Paulus's eyes and said, "Are rules something bad, Pastor?" Pastor Paulus frowned. "Of course, too many rules will only burden humans. God does not want humans to live in attachment." Zachariah nodded slowly, then asked, "So why do you have the 10 Commandments of God? Aren't those also rules?" Pastor Paulus was shocked. The congregation, who were initially sure, was now silent again. Zachariah continued, "Doesn't every religion have rules? Even in this country, you have to follow the law, pay taxes, and obey traffic regulations. Do you consider all that a burden, or are those rules there to maintain order and goodness?" Pastor Paulus bit his lip, knowing this child was leading him into a logical trap that was difficult to deny. Zachariah took a small step closer, then said, "God gave humans rules not to torture them, but to protect them from destruction. If humans do anything without rules, wouldn't this world be full of evil?" The congregation began to think. Some of them looked shaken. Pastor Paulus sighed, his eyes full of anger. Not at the small child who stood before him, but at the silence that filled the room. Then the question struck like lightning in the middle of that silence. With a trembling voice, Pastor Paulus answered, "Jesus came to save humans." "He wants us," Zachariah interrupted, "but humans are born with original sin, right?" Pastor Paulus swallowed hard. Zachariah smiled softly and asked again, "Then, if a newborn baby dies before being baptized, does he go to hell?" Pastor Paulus was silent. The congregation began to look at each other. Some of them looked restless. Zacharias continued, "How could a baby who had not committed a sin have to bear the guilt that was not his? Isn't God most just?" There were words that were unto keken kehilangan, is jengotana katayang gisber, manundurkan kepatahita, and whispered, "Oh my God, show the truth to those who seek the truth." When he opened his eyes, the church was silent. It was the sound of anger, something more. Something had happened to the people who were in it. Zach raised his hand, a little bit of arrogance on his face. "I just ask and share, Pastor. If I say, 'Eat me,' there is still something, right? I feed me, a little child, but not God. Is patient only, Pastor?" His chest rose and fell. After a year in Ambaru, he had all the answers. But today, a 5-year-old boy had silenced him. The boy's words cut deeper than a sword, dismantling every pride and belief he had maintained. The whole church remained silent. Some of the congregation shed tears. Some others were still trapped in their own minds. There was no more cheering, no more jeers. Even the anger that had previously burned in Pastor Paul's eyes now dimmed, replaced by something he had never felt before: doubt. Zacharias smiled a little, then turned around. With light steps, he walked toward the church door. No one dared to stop him. Even Pastor Paul could only stare at the small back moving away. Before stepping out, Zachariah turned once more and said softly, "May God guide us all." Then with the most innocent smile, he left the church, leaving Pastor Paul standing still. And leaving the entire church sinking into a silence deeper than before. Not because of defeat, not because of anger, but because their hearts had been touched by something they had never suspected was true. This is the end of our video. If you enjoy Islamic content like this, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.